Millionaire slapped his elderly mother in front of everyone. It was a clear, brisk morning in New York City, the kind that hinted at change in the air. The streets were buzzing with the usual energy. Taxis honking, pedestrians weaving through crowds, and the towering skyscrapers casting long shadows on the sidewalk below. But in one of the city's most exclusive penthouses, nestled high above the chaos, a storm was quietly brewing. Inside the sleek, modern apartment on the 45th floor, the air was thick with tension. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline, but the view felt distant, disconnected, as if the world beyond was irrelevant to the drama unfolding within these four walls. It was a kind of place where money flowed like water, and every inch screamed success. Yet, despite the wealth, the opulence, and the luxury, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of something far more sinister simmering beneath the surface. Richard Holt was a name known across the country, a self-made millionaire who had clawed his way to the top with a combination of ruthless business tactics and a relentless drive. He was a man whose presence commanded respect, or at least that was what he thought, to the public. He was a model of success, a philanthropist who donated millions to causes he barely understood, and a powerful figure whose influence reached into every corner of the financial world. To his family, though, Richard was something else entirely, a man whose ambition had long overshadowed his humanity. His mother, Evelyn Holt, sat quietly in the corner of the room. Her frail hands clutched the armrest of her chair, the wrinkles on her face telling stories of a life well lived but now dimmed by age. She had raised Richard on her own, pouring every ounce of love into him, even when it meant sacrificing her own dreams. Her life had been one of hardship, but her heart was always full of hope. Hope that her son would someday understand the value of compassion, of family, of love. But as the years passed and Richard's empire grew, that hope began to fade. What had once been a loving mother-son relationship had deteriorated into something colder, more transactional. Evelyn knew her son had changed, but she couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when he stopped being the boy she had raised and started becoming the man he was today. It was as though the money, the power, and the success had consumed him, leaving only a shell of the person she had known. The day began like any other. Richard had arrived at the penthouse early, his sharp suit pressed perfectly, his hair meticulously styled. He was a picture of confidence, his posture radiating authority. Evelyn, on the other hand, had been in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as she had for years, despite the fact that she no longer needed to. She had always been a nurturer, a caretaker, and though her body was frilier than it used to be, she still found comfort in small acts of service. But today, something felt different. Richard's demeanor was colder than usual, and the tension in the air was palpable. Evelyn had tried to engage him in conversation, but he had brushed her off, his mind elsewhere, his eyes flicking impatiently toward the clock on the wall. And then it happened, as Evelyn set the breakfast on the table, her hands trembling slightly. Richard's voice cut through the silence, sharp and accusatory. "You've done nothing but hold me back my entire life, haven't you?" His words were like daggers, cold and calculated. Evelyn's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief passing through them. "What do you mean, Richard? I've always supported you." But before she could finish, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. The sound reverberated through the room, a prelude to the storm that was about to unfold. Without warning, Richard's hand flew out, connecting with Evelyn's cheek in a loud, brutal slap that echoed through the luxurious apartment. Time seemed to freeze as the world around them seemed to blur, leaving only the sound of Evelyn's soft gasp in the air. Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't say a word. There was no need to. The shock of the moment hung heavy between them. Richard stood there, his breath shallow, his face flushed with a mix of anger and something darker. His eyes were wild, like a man on the edge, as if the weight of everything he had built had finally snapped something inside him. Evelyn, however, remained silent, her gaze fixed on her son. The slap had not been a moment of anger. It had been a culmination of years of resentment, of broken dreams, of love twisted into something unrecognizable. And now, in front of the staff, in front of the world, everything was laid bare. The truth that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long had finally come to light, and there was no turning back. The room, once filled with a gleam of wealth and success, now felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. What had driven Richard to this point? What had happened to the boy who had once looked to his mother with admiration, with love? This was no longer just a family drama. It was a battle for something far deeper, something far more important. The fragile bond between mother and son had been shattered in an instant, and the question now lingered in the air. Was there any way to repair it, or had the damage been done for good? Evelyn didn't move. She didn't raise her hand to her cheek, didn't flinch, didn't even cry out. She simply sat there, her frail frame still, her hands gripping the armrest of the chair as if anchoring herself to something deeper than this moment. But her silence spoke louder than any words could. The entire room had frozen. The house staff, who had been bustling around the kitchen and dining area, setting the table and preparing the morning routine, stood in stunned horror. A maid clutched a tray so tightly that the porcelain plates on top rattled. The butler, an elderly man who had served the family for decades, swallowed hard but said nothing. They had all witnessed arguments between Richard and his mother before. They had heard the sharp words, the dismissive tone, the frustration in his voice. But never had they seen it escalate to this. For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. The slap seemed to hang in the air, a shocking and violent crack that still echoed in everyone's ears. Richard, still standing, exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. His fingers twitched at his side, as though even he was startled by his own action. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling beneath the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. The weight of what he had done settled on him, but not in the way it should have. There was no immediate regret in his eyes, no sign of remorse. Instead, there was something else, something darker. It wasn't just anger that had driven him to this moment. It was years of resentment, years of feeling like he was never enough in her eyes. The guilt of his own choices, the loneliness that came with his success, the lingering pain of a child who had spent in struggle. It had all boiled over in that single moment of weakness. And now, there was no taking it back. Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes to meet her son's. Her cheek was reddened, the outline of his hand already beginning to show against her pale skin. But there was no anger in her expression, no hatred, only sadness, the kind of deep, aching sorrow that cuts deeper than any wound. "I never held you back, Richard," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her body. "I only ever wanted you to be happy." Something flickered in Richard's gaze. It wasn't quite recognition, but something close. For a split second, something like guilt flashed across his face, but just as quickly, it was gone. His walls went up again, his expression hardening, his posture rigid. "Happy?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "You think happiness has anything to do with this world?" He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "I built everything from nothing, Mother. I worked myself to the bone to get here. And what do I get in return? Judgment, doubt, like I was never good enough for you." Evelyn sighed, her eyes never leaving his. "Richard, I have never judged you. I have only ever worried for you, because you lost yourself along the way." The words hit him like a slap of their own, but he refused to show it. He let out another sharp breath and turned away, pacing toward the grand windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. The city sprawled beneath him, the endless skyline stretching into the distance, its vastness mirroring the hollow feeling in his chest. He didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to care. But Evelyn's words clung to him, echoing in the hollow spaces of his mind, in the places he had tried so hard to bury with money, success, and power. "I didn't lose myself," he said after a long pause, his back still turned to her. "I did what I had to do. I survived. I won." Evelyn let out a tired breath. "At what cost?" Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides. He didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he just didn't want to admit it. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The staff still stood frozen in the background, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they had seen nothing. It wasn't their place to speak, but they all knew that something irreversible had just happened. Finally, Evelyn pushed herself up from her chair. It took effort. Her joints ached, her body weak with age. But she moved with quiet dignity, straightening her spine despite the sting in her cheek. She stepped toward Richard, her voice calm but firm. "You may have all the money in the world, my son, but if you lose the people who love you, you will have nothing." Richard didn't turn around. He couldn't. He didn't want to see the disappointment in her eyes. He didn't want to face what he had just done. Evelyn stood there for another moment before sighing softly and turning away. Without another word, she began walking toward the hallway, her steps slow but purposeful. But as she passed the stunned staff, her quiet voice carried through the air. "Make sure he eats," she said gently to the maid, "even if he doesn't want to." Then, without another glance, she disappeared down the hall, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt as though the entire penthouse had been swallowed by it. Richard finally turned, but it was too late. She was gone, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. A hollow kind of regret, a crack in the armor he had spent so long building, and the terrifying realization that he might have just lost the only person who had ever truly loved him. The silence in the penthouse lingered long after Evelyn had left the room. The house staff, still stunned, exchanged uneasy glances before quietly resuming their tasks, careful not to disturb a fragile tension that clung to the air like fog. The weight of what had happened was undeniable, yet no one dared to speak of it. Richard stood motionless by the window, his reflection staring back at him against the backdrop of the vast cityscape. The hand that had struck his mother tingled as if it, too, felt the shame he refused to acknowledge. His mind was a storm, anger, resentment, and something else, something he didn't want to name, churned inside him. Then his phone vibrated, a sharp, insistent buzz that shattered the stillness. He pulled it from his pocket and saw the name flashing across the screen, Jonathan Crane, his most trusted lawyer, business strategist, and, if he was honest, the closest thing he had to a friend. Richard hesitated before answering. "What?" His voice was clipped, impatient. Crane sighed on the other end. "I take it you've seen the news." Richard stiffened. "What news?" Another sigh. Then a pause. "Check your email." And, "Richard, brace yourself." The call ended. A cold knot twisted in Richard's stomach as he moved to his sleek mahogany desk. He sat down, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before opening his inbox. The subject line of the latest email sent a sharp jolt through his system. "Billionaire Richard Holt slaps his elderly mother." Shocking footage leaked. His heart pounded as he clicked the link. A grainy but unmistakable video clip played on the screen. It had been recorded from a hallway security camera, likely leaked by someone on the staff. Though the footage was slightly distorted, the sound was crystal clear. The sharp crack of the slap, his mother's soft gasp, and the stunned silence that followed. It was all there. Within seconds, a wave of headlines flooded his screen. America's wealthiest son. Richard Holt's disgusting act against his own mother, the man with millions but no heart. Public outrage against Richard Holt. Will Holt's empire crumble? Investors react to PR disaster. His hands clench into fists. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a full-blown crisis. His company, Holt Enterprises, thrived on public perception. It wasn't just about business. It was about image. His success wasn't built solely on financial strategies. It was built on reputation, power, and the belief that he was an untouchable force in the corporate world. But this was different. This wasn't a business misstep. This wasn't a lawsuit or an insider leak. This was personal. And worse, this was public. His thoughts were interrupted by another call. This time, it was from his CFO, Greg Mathers. Richard took a deep breath before answering. "Richard," Greg started, his voice tight. "We have a problem. A huge problem." "I'm aware," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Our stock is already dipping," Greg continued. "Investors are panicking. We've had 3 major clients call to express concerns, and the media is having a field day. They're demanding a response." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose, frustration mounting. "What's our damage control strategy?" "We need an official statement now," Greg urged. "Something to shift the narrative. Maybe an apology." Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't apologize." Greg hesitated. "Richard, you don't have a choice this time. The board is meeting in 2 hours. If you don't get ahead of this, they will force your hand. Richard's grip on his phone tightened. Forced? By his own company? He had built Holt Enterprises from the ground up. He had made them billions. And now, because of one moment, one slip, they were ready to turn against him? Richard's stomach churned. He was used to being the one in control, the one making the rules. But this felt different. And worst of all, it was his mother at the center of it. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. Of all the people in the world who could have destroyed him, he never imagined it would be her. He wasn't going to let this happen. No, if the world thought they could bring Richard Holt down, they were about to learn the hard way. He never lost. But deep down, a question gnawed at him. Was this really a battle he could win? Or had he already lost something far more important? Richard barely had time to process the crisis before another call flashed on his phone. This time from his sister, Olivia Holt. He considered ignoring it, but he knew Olivia wouldn't back down. She never did. With a sigh, he answered, "What the hell is wrong with you, Richard?" Her voice was sharp, laced with fury. "I just saw the video. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Richard clenched his jaw. "I don't have time for a lecture, Olivia." "Oh, you'll make time," she snapped. "Because while you're sitting in your ivory tower, your mother, the woman who raised us, who sacrificed everything for us, is being hounded by reporters outside her house. She's being harassed, Richard, all because of you." A twinge of guilt stabbed at him, but he shoved it down. "I didn't leak the damn video." "That's not the point." Olivia seethed. "You hit her, and now the entire world knows. You think an expensive PR team is going to fix this." Richard ran a hand down his face. He wasn't in the mood for this. "Not now. What do you want me to do, Olivia? Get on my knees and beg for forgiveness. For once in your miserable life, I want you to take responsibility." Olivia's voice cracked. "But I know you won't. You never do." Silence. Olivia exhaled, her tone softer now. "Richard, she still loves you, even after what you did. She won't even let me speak against you publicly. She's trying to protect you. And what are you doing for her?" Richard swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Fix this," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "before it's too late." The line went dead. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the city skyline stretched before him, bright and endless. But for the first time in his life, it felt like the walls were closing in. And for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in her small, cozy house, far from the glass towers and penthouses Richard called home. The air outside buzzed with reporters, their cameras flashing through the curtains, their voices shouting for a statement. But inside, all was quiet. She traced a finger along the rim of her teacup, her thoughts heavy. The world had turned her private pain into a spectacle, but that wasn't what troubled her most. It was the emptiness in her son's eyes. She had seen it long before the slap, long before the money, the power, the ruthless ambition. Somewhere along the way, Richard had lost himself, and she feared that if he didn't find his way back soon, he never would. Richard sat in his office, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his desk as he stared at the endless flood of headlines. His team had crafted a generic statement, a misunderstanding, deep regret, a private family matter, but it wasn't enough. The damage was done. Investors were panicking. The board was growing restless, and the media refused to let the scandal die. Worse, his mother refused to speak publicly. If she defended him, the narrative could shift. But she remained silent, tucked away in her modest home, ignoring his calls. A knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Jonathan Crane stepped in, his expression grim. "It's getting worse." He tossed the folder onto the desk. "Legal threats. Some advocacy groups are calling for an investigation into elder abuse. If this goes to court, it won't," Richard said coldly, though a knot tightened in his stomach. "Richard." Crane leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We need to consider drastic action. A press conference. A personal apology." Richard slammed his fist on the desk. "I don't apologize." Crane studied him carefully. Then tell me what's the plan. Because if you think this will just disappear, you're delusional. Richard's jaw clenched. For the first time in his life, he felt something slipping through his fingers. Control, power. His entire empire rested on perception, and right now, the world saw him as nothing more than a heartless monster. The door burst open before he could answer. Olivia stood there, her face red with fury. "Olivia, this isn't—" Crane started, but she ignored him, storming toward Richard's desk. "You really thought you could fix this with money and PR tricks," she hissed. "Do you even care about her, Richard?" Richard shot to his feet, his patience finally snapping. "You think I don't care? Everything I've done, every sacrifice I've made was for this family. No!" Olivia cut him off, her voice shaking. "Everything you've done was for yourself. And now, for the first time, you're facing consequences and you can't handle it." Her words hit deeper than he expected. "I spoke to Mom," Olivia continued. "Do you know what she said?" Richard remained silent. "She's worried about you, Richard, even after what you did." Olivia's voice softened. "But she won't protect you this time. If you want to make this right, you have to be the one to go to her." Richard's throat tightened. For a man who built his life on power and control, the idea of facing his mother, of admitting he was wrong, felt impossible. But deep down, he knew if he didn't act now, he might lose her forever. And for the first time in his life, Richard Holt was afraid. Richard sat in the back of his black luxury sedan, his hands clasped together as he stared blankly out the tinted window. The city skyline blurred past him, the same skyline he had once conquered with ruthless ambition. But today, he wasn't heading to a corporate takeover or a high-stakes meeting. He was going home, not to his penthouse, not to his office, but to the modest house where his mother still lived, the one she had refused to leave, even when it offered her mansions, luxury, and everything money could buy. The thought unsettled him. He had spent his life clawing his way to the top, proving that power and wealth meant everything. And yet, here he was, powerless in the one battle that truly mattered. His driver pulled up in front of the house. Even before the car fully stopped, Richard could see the reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing like vultures circling prey. His jaw tightened. He had spent years keeping his private life locked away, and now the whole world was watching him unravel. "Sir, are you sure about this?" his driver asked, concern in his voice. Richard didn't answer. He simply opened the door, stepping out into the chaos. The moment he did, the reporters swarmed. "Mr. Holt, do you have a response to the public outrage? Are you here to apologize to your mother? Have your investors threatened to pull out?" Richard ignored them all, his face a mask of cold indifference. But inside, his pulse pounded. The questions, the flashing lights, the judgmental stares, it all clawed at him. For the first time, he truly felt what it meant to be alone. He reached the front door and knocked, the sound oddly fragile against the storm of voices behind him. A long silence stretched before, finally, the door creaked open. Evelyn stood there, her frail form framed by the dim light inside. She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She just looked at him. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The cameras flashed wildly behind him, but for the first time, he didn't care. "Come in," she said softly. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The door shut behind him, muffling the outside world. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the warmth of the house, the scent of old books and cinnamon tea. It all felt so distant, like another life. Evelyn studied him, her wise eyes unreadable. "Why are you here, Richard?" He swallowed hard. He stopped, exhaling sharply. Why was he here? To save his reputation? To stop the scandal from destroying his empire? Or was it something more? Evelyn didn't press him. She simply walked to the small wooden table in the living room and sat down. "Have some tea," she said. "Then we'll talk." And just like that, the battle he had spent his life fighting, the one against his own humanity, began to crumble. For the first time in years, Richard Holt sat across from his mother, not as a billionaire, not as a man desperate to control his fate, but simply as her son. Richard sat stiffly at the small wooden table, watching as his mother poured tea with steady hands. The clinking of the porcelain was the only sound in the room. He had faced boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, conquer hostile takeovers, and build an empire from nothing. But sitting here, across from his mother, he felt like a child again. Evelyn slid a cup toward him and took a sip of her own. "Go on," she said gently, "before the tea gets cold." Richard hesitated, then picked up the cup. The warmth seeped into his fingers, grounding him in a way he didn't expect. He took a sip, the familiar taste of chamomile and honey settling in his throat. It was the same tea she used to make when he was younger, when he'd come home from school with scraped knees, or when he sat by her side after his father left. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Evelyn broke it. "I never wanted your money, Richard. I never needed your mansions or your cars. I only ever wanted my son." Richard clenched his jaw. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "Everything I worked for, everything I built. It was supposed to be for us, for the family." Evelyn shook her head. "You built it for yourself." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to remind her how much he had sacrificed. But as he looked into her tired eyes, he saw something he wasn't prepared for. Sadness. Not for herself, but for him. The weight of it hit him harder than any scandal ever could. He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "I don't know how to fix this." Evelyn reached across the table, placing her wrinkled hand over his. "You start by being honest with yourself." Richard swallowed hard. His empire was crumbling, his reputation in shambles, and yet none of it felt as important as this moment. He had spent years chasing power, wealth, and control, only to realize he had lost the one thing that mattered most. And now, sitting across from his mother, he finally understood what Olivia had been trying to tell him. It wasn't about damage control. It wasn't about saving face. It was about redemption. And redemption, he knew, had to be earned. Taking a deep breath, Richard met his mother's gaze. "I want to make things right," he said, his voice steady. "Not for the cameras. Not for the company. For us." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Then let's start." And for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was finally taking the right step forward. Richard remained at the small wooden table long after their conversation began, his tea untouched, his mind racing. For the first time in his life, he had no strategy, no carefully crafted statement, no calculated move to fix the situation. All he had was his mother's unwavering patience and the heavy silence between them. Evelyn sighed, breaking the quiet. "You were always so determined, Richard. Even as a boy, you wanted to win. You wanted to prove yourself." She gave him a sad smile. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped proving it to yourself and started proving it to the world." Richard swallowed hard. He thought back to his childhood, to the days when he would come home beaming after getting the highest score in class, only for his father to brush him aside with a grunt and a glance at the newspaper. The hunger to be seen, to be respected, had started early. It had fueled him through college, through ruthless business deals, through every moment of his climb to the top. And yet, sitting here now, stripped of all his power and prestige, he realized something terrifying. He had become the very man he had spent his life trying to prove himself to. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom." Evelyn's gaze softened, but she didn't rush to comfort him. "I know, Richard, but that doesn't change the fact that you did." Richard exhaled, rubbing his hands together as if trying to chase away the cold creeping into his bones. "I spent so many years thinking money could fix everything, that success could erase the past. But now," he let out a bitter chuckle, "now I don't even know who I am anymore." Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Then maybe it's time you find out." A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with business talk or distractions. Then, softly, Evelyn said, "Come with me." Richard hesitated, but when she stood, he followed. She led him to a small, cluttered room at the back of the house. The scent of old paper and faded wood filled the space, and Richard realized with a jolt that it was his childhood bedroom. Nothing had changed. His old desk was still pushed against the wall. The worn-out chair still creaked as Evelyn sat down. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a small, faded box. "I kept this," she said, handing it to him. Richard lifted the lid and inhaled sharply. Inside were old report cards, school drawings, birthday cards he had given her as a boy. There was even a yellowed letter in his father's handwriting, the only one he had ever written before disappearing from their lives. His fingers trembled as he sifted through the memories. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You've spent your whole life building something, Richard, but you forgot where you came from." Richard closed the box, his heart pounding. Maybe it wasn't too late to change that. Maybe, for the first time, he could build something real, something that wasn't measured in wealth, but in who he chose to be. And for the first time in years, he wanted to try. A week later, Richard stood before a podium in a packed press conference. Reporters filled the room, cameras flashing, microphones angled to catch his every word. The world was still watching, still waiting for his next move. But for once, Richard didn't care about appearances. He took a deep breath and looked directly into the cameras. "I have spent my life chasing success, believing that power and wealth could define me. But I was wrong. Recently, I hurt the one person who has always stood by me, my mother." He paused, his throat tightening. "I can't take back what I did, but I can acknowledge it, and I can start making things right." The room was silent, the usual hunger for scandal momentarily replaced by something else. Genuine interest. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight," Richard continued. "I don't expect the world to forget. But this is not about public image or damage control. It's about being a better son, a better man." He stepped back, ignoring the barrage of questions that followed. His statement wasn't for them. It was for his mother. Later that evening, he returned to her house, this time with no cameras, no press. Just him. Evelyn was waiting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. When he sat beside her, she didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she sighed. "I heard your speech," she said. Richard nodded. "I meant every word." Evelyn turned to look at him, her eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that had always been there, even when he was too blind to see it. "Then show me." Richard exhaled, nodding. This wasn't something he could fix overnight. It wasn't a business deal he could negotiate his way out of. It was going to take time. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to put in the work. And for the first time, he wasn't doing it for money, power, or reputation. He was doing it for something far more valuable: family.